My name is Josiah. I am 41 years old, and I am the man who looked a woman in the eye, a woman who believed she was God, and told her she owned nothing of me. Not my hands, not my seed, not my soul. It was 1842, in the deep Georgia heat, and the cotton fields stretched white and endless, like a lie the land kept telling itself. I had been pulled from Virginia like a root torn from dry earth, separated from my wife, from my boy, from everything that made me a man and not a machine. And the moment I arrived at the Whitfield plantation, I felt it. A cold that had nothing to do with wind. Something was waiting for me there. Something dressed in silk and perfume and madness, standing on a painted porch like a queen, surveying her kingdom of broken people. If this story is already pulling at something inside you, if you felt what I felt just hearing those first words, please hit that subscribe button right now. My family counts on every single person who stays with me until the end. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Are you in Texas, Ohio, London, Madrid? It doesn't matter where you are. What matters is that stories like mine are never forgotten. Like this video, stay with me, because what happens next changed everything. But before I tell you what happened inside those white marble walls, before I take you into the darkest room in that house, I need you to understand something. What Elelena Whitfield wanted from me was not labor. It was not obedience. What she wanted was something so twisted, so far outside the law of God and man, that when I finally understood it, my blood ran cold in spite of the Georgia summer. She wanted to use my body to rebuild her bloodline. She wanted me, a man she legally owned, to father a new generation of masters. And she had already chosen which of her daughters would be first. If you think you have heard stories of slavery before, you have not heard this one. Stay with me, because what I survived will change the way you see history forever. The Whitfield plantation smelled like iron and jasmine, and I learned quickly that those two things should never exist together. The big house sat on a hill like a crown nobody had earned, white columns rising against a sky so blue it felt like mockery. Around it, the fields rolled out in every direction, pale and endless, and the cabins where we slept were pressed into the far edge of the land like an afterthought, like something the owner wanted to forget was there. The Georgia sun did not warm that place. It punished it. By 6 in the morning, the heat was already sitting on your shoulders like a man twice your size. The soil was red as dried blood, and every time I pushed a hoe into it, I thought about the bones that must have been buried underneath. The land remembered what the people tried to forget. I could feel it in my feet every single morning. My days began before the roosters. I carried water, split wood, repaired fences, and moved between tasks like a wheel that was never allowed to stop turning. The overseers watched with eyes that were always looking for an excuse. I had learned early in Virginia that stillness was dangerous. A man who stopped moving gave them a reason. So I moved. I worked with my head down and my mind somewhere else entirely, somewhere they could not reach. I thought about my wife, Ruth's hands, the way they smelled like cedar. I thought about my son, James, and the way he laughed with his whole body. I used those memories like water, small sips to keep myself alive through the long, burning hours. The other men watched me with a quiet respect because I never broke, never cried out, never gave the overseers the satisfaction of seeing me bend. But inside, I was already fracturing. The wound I carried was not on my back. Not yet. It was in my chest, a hollow place where my family used to live. I had been sold at auction 14 months before arriving at Whitfield, pulled away from Ruth while she screamed my name loud enough to make the auction house go quiet for one terrible second. James was 7 years old. He reached for me with both arms, and the man holding him just turned away like my boy was nothing but weight. I had not cried that day. I made myself a promise that I would carry their faces like a torch, and I would not let this world extinguish it. But some nights, lying on a thin mat in the dark, listening to men weep in their sleep around me, I felt the flame flicker. And on those nights, the only thing that kept me breathing was the belief that God had not looked away, that He was watching, that this was not the end of my story. I was wrong about many things in those days, but not about that. The night everything changed came without warning, the way the worst things always do. It was a Tuesday in late August, the air so thick with humidity, it felt like breathing through wet cloth. I had been at Whitfield for 3 months when one of the house servants, an old woman named Clara, came to find me at the water trough just before sundown. She did not look at me when she spoke. She kept her eyes on the ground and her voice low as gravel. "The mistress wants you inside," she said. "Tonight." Those 4 words landed in my stomach like stones dropped in still water. I had seen other men called to the big house at strange hours. Some came back changed. Some did not come back at all. I washed my hands slowly, deliberately, and followed Clara up the hill toward those white columns, feeling the eyes of every man in the field burning into my back like brands. Inside, the house was cooler, but no less suffocating. Elela Nena Whitfield was waiting in the parlor, seated in a high-backed chair like a throne, wearing black silk even in that heat, a widow's uniform she had never abandoned. She was perhaps 50, with sharp gray eyes that missed absolutely nothing, and a stillness about her that reminded me of a snake before it strikes. She looked at me the way a man looks at a horse he is considering purchasing, measuring, calculating, deciding. She did not offer me a seat. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "I have been watching you, Josiah. You are not like the others." And I understood immediately, with a cold certainty that settled in my bones, that those words were not a compliment. They were the closing of a trap I had not seen being built around me. She laid it out plainly, the way cruel people sometimes do when they have convinced themselves their cruelty is logic. Her husband had been weak, she said. Her 5 daughters carried thin blood, fragile constitutions. She needed strength reintroduced into her line. Physical strength, endurance, the kind of vitality she had observed in me over 3 months of deliberate, calculating study. She spoke about it the way a farmer speaks about cross-breeding livestock, without shame, without hesitation, as though the obscenity of what she was proposing was simply a practical matter of agriculture. I stood very still. I kept my face empty the way I had learned to do when the world showed me its ugliest face. But inside, something ancient and furious rose up from the deepest part of me. A rage so enormous and so hot that I was almost afraid of it myself. Almost. The first wall I hit came the very next morning. Word travels fast on a plantation. Faster than wind, faster than horses. By sunrise, the overseers knew that I had been summoned to the big house, and they did not like it. The head overseer, a broad, red-faced man named Garrett, found me at the woodpile before breakfast and stood too close, the way men do when they want you to feel small. "You think you're something special now, boy?" he said, his voice low and wet with contempt. He took the axe from my hand slowly, deliberately, making sure I understood who held the power in that moment. I looked at him without blinking. I said nothing. But Garrett was the kind of man who needed a reaction to feel real, and my silence infuriated him more than any words could have. He shoved me hard against the woodpile and walked away. That shove was a warning. It would not be the last one. At night, lying in the dark with the sound of crickets filling the Georgia air, I turned the situation over in my mind like a stone I was trying to find all the edges of. I thought about Ruth. I thought about what she would say if she could see me in that moment, trapped between a mad woman's ambition and an overseer's hatred, with no door visible in any direction. Ruth was a practical woman, fierce and clear-eyed. She would have told me to think before I moved, because a man who runs blind runs into walls. So I thought. I cataloged everything I knew about Elena Whitfield. Her pride, her isolation, her obsession with legacy. And slowly, like a shape emerging from fog, I began to understand that her plan was also her weakness. She needed my cooperation. And that meant, for perhaps the first time in my life on that plantation, I held something she wanted badly enough to negotiate. But before I could act on that fragile understanding, the situation became violently worse. Garrett went to Elena and told her I had been insubordinate. A lie constructed carefully from my silence and my stillness, the only weapons I had allowed myself. She summoned me to the yard the following afternoon, in front of every soul on that plantation. The whipping post stood in the center of the yard like an altar to everything wrong with that world, and Garrett tied my wrists to it with the practiced efficiency of a man who enjoyed his work. I did not beg. I did not cry out. I counted the lashes the way a man counts steps on a long road, one at a time, eyes forward, mind fixed on something beyond the pain. 12 strokes. When it was over and they cut me down, I stood on my own 2 feet. I refused to fall. And I saw something flicker across Elena's face in that moment that frightened me more than the whip had. Admiration. That admiration made everything more dangerous. She doubled down. She dismissed Garrett from his duties near the house, had my wounds dressed by Clara, and increased the pressure of her plan with a terrifying calm. She began sending her eldest daughter, Margaret, to bring me water in the afternoons. A transparent, humiliating choreography designed to normalize what she intended. Margaret was perhaps 20 years old, with a mother's gray eyes and a terror in them that she could not fully conceal. The girl did not want this any more than I did. I could see it in the rigid set of her shoulders, the way her hands shook slightly when she handed me the ladle. We were both prisoners of the same woman's madness, separated only by the color of our skin and the specific nature of our chains. The realization hit me like cold water. Elena was not only destroying me, she was destroying her own children. And then came the night that broke something open inside me permanently. I was summoned again to the parlor, but this time all 5 daughters were present, arranged on settees like porcelain figures their mother had positioned with great care. Elena stood at the center of the room and spoke to them about duty, about legacy, about the weakness of their father's blood and the necessity of what she had planned, as though I were not standing 6 feet away hearing every word. The youngest daughter, a girl of perhaps 15, small and dark-haired, was weeping silently, tears running down her face while she stared at her hands. And that image, that child crying in silence because no one in her world had the power to protect her from her own mother, reached inside me and grabbed something I thought had gone numb. I looked at that girl and I saw James. I saw my son. And I knew with absolute certainty that I could not walk away from this room and do nothing. The revelation came from Clara. Old, quiet Clara, who had survived 30 years in that house by making herself invisible, who moved through rooms like smoke and heard everything. She found me behind the kitchen the following morning and pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm without slowing her walk, without looking at me, without a single word. I waited until I was alone to open it. It was a letter, old, water-stained at the edges, written in a man's careful hand. It was dated 1831. It was signed by Elena's husband, Cornelius Whitfield, and it was addressed to a lawyer in Savannah. In it, Cornelius described his wife's mental deterioration in precise, frightened language. He wrote that she had become convinced that God had given her a divine mission to build a perfect bloodline, that she had already attempted to execute this plan once before, with a man named Solomon, who had disappeared from the plantation in the winter of 1830 and was never spoken of again. My blood went cold and still as standing water. Suddenly, every piece fell into its place with a terrible, locking precision. Solomon had not run. Clara's silence all these years was not submission. It was survival, and it was guilt, and it was the carrying of a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. Elena had done this before, and when it had gone wrong, when Solomon had refused, or when the plan had unraveled, he had simply vanished. No record, no grave, no name spoken ever again on Whitfield land. And Cornelius, rather than stopping her, had written a letter to a lawyer and then died of fever 2 years later, leaving his madness to rot inside those white walls undisturbed. I understood now why Clara had made herself invisible for 30 years. I understood why the daughters moved through that house like ghosts. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost like peace, that Elena Whitfield was not merely cruel. She was dangerous in the specific, patient way of someone who had already killed, and had learned to live comfortably with that fact. The options I had were not really options at all. They were just different shapes of destruction. I could submit, and in doing so, destroy every remaining fragment of what made me a man, condemning those girls to a future built on violation and madness, and sealing my own fate the moment I was no longer useful to her plan. I could run alone in the night, and perhaps make it to the river. But Garrett's dogs knew my scent, and a black man running alone through Georgia in 1842 rarely made it further than the tree line before the world closed in on him. Or I could do the thing that terrified me most, the thing that required not just courage, but a kind of reckless faith that God was still watching and had not yet turned his face away. I could stay long enough to take someone with me. I could reach through the bars of Margaret's cage and Mary Ann's cage and pull at least one of them towards something resembling survival. The question was whether any of them were willing to run toward freedom with a man the law said was not even a person. It was Mary Ann who found me first. The second daughter, 22 years old, with her father's softer eyes and a fury she had learned to keep folded very small and very deep inside herself. She came to the woodpile at dusk, alone, moving with the deliberate casualness of someone who had rehearsed, looking innocent. She crouched beside the stack of timber as though checking something, and spoke without looking at me, her voice barely above breath. "I know what she's done before," she whispered. "I know about Solomon." Those 5 words told me everything I needed to know about who Mary Ann Whitfield really was, beneath the silk and the silence. She was not her mother's daughter. She was her father's, frightened, decent, trapped, and finally desperate enough to do something about it. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, very quietly, "Can you swim?" She looked at me then, directly, for the first time, and she nodded. The storm came on a Thursday, the way Mary Ann had said it would. She had watched the Georgia sky her whole life, and she knew its moods like a language. We moved in the hour before midnight, when the rain was loud enough to swallow the sound of our footsteps, and the lightning threw brief, violent light across the fields in pulses. I had the letter from Cornelius folded against my chest, pressed flat beneath my shirt. Evidence, I told myself, though I did not yet know for whom. Mary Ann met me at the edge of the kitchen garden, wearing dark wool and carrying nothing but a small canvas bag, and the expression of a woman who has already grieved everything she is leaving behind. We did not speak. We ran low and fast through the rows of cotton, the wet plants slapping against our arms, the red mud pulling at our feet, like the land itself was trying to hold us there. Behind us, the big house blazed with candlelight. Ella La Nena was awake. She was always awake. And then we heard it. The dogs. Garrett's voice cut through the rain like an axe. And the dogs were close, terrifyingly close. Their baying, a sound that reached inside your chest and squeezed. We hit the riverbank at a full run, and I grabbed Mary Ann's hand, and we went into the water without slowing, without hesitating, because hesitation in that moment was death. The river was cold and fast and dark as iron, and it hit me like a wall, knocking the breath from my lungs. I held on to Marianne and kicked hard, pulling us away from the bank, while the current grabbed us and carried us downstream with terrifying speed. I heard Garrett shouting on the bank, heard the dogs losing our scent at the water's edge, heard Elelanena's voice rising above the rain in a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a word. Something raw and animal and ancient. The sound of a woman watching her empire dissolve into a river she could not follow us into. The current took us around a bend. The voices faded. The rain kept falling. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, the only sound was water. I never found Ruth and James. That is the truth I carry every day, like a stone in my chest that time has not worn smooth. Marianne and I made it north, moving by night and by faith, and by the kindness of strangers who risked everything to feed us and point us toward the next safe house. The letter from Cornelius found its way to an abolitionist newspaper in Philadelphia, and the name Elelaneina Whitfield was printed in black ink for all the decent world to read. The plantation fell apart within 2 years. Debts, scandal, daughters who scattered like seeds in wind to escape their mother's shadow. Elelaneina herself died alone in that big house in 1847, they say, with no one beside her but the silence she had built around herself over a lifetime of cruelty. And me, I became something I had not planned on becoming. I became a voice. I stood in churches and meeting halls in the north, and I told this story exactly as I have told it to you, because the only weapon I had left was the truth. Some wounds never close, but they can become the reason another man's wound is prevented. That is enough. That has to be enough.